This podcast is made possible by our supporters on Patreon, who pledge an amount to contribute every month and in return get exclusive access to bonus content, merchandise discounts, and much more. If you'd like to join our family, please go to patreon.com/Gotham Variety and subscribe. That's Patreon/Gotham Variety.
And greetings to you. Joe Rubenstein here, producer and host of the Gotham Variety Podcast. I want to welcome all of our listeners. I thank you very much for your support and for joining me today. Hoping you enjoy this latest installment of a series on boxing. Last time we talked about Joe Frazier. In upcoming shows, I'll be covering George Foreman, Rocky Marciano, and one of the great lightweights ever, Barney Ross. He fought in the 1930s. But for today's show, I asked today's guest, boxing writer Mike Ezra, to rank all 23 undisputed heavyweight champions from Jack Dempsey to Lennox Lewis. Now, just to be clear, the fact that Lewis is the last undisputed champ does not mean that there haven't been some excellent heavyweights either this century or before Dempsey. Certainly Jack Johnson was an all-time great. But what makes a champion undisputed is that he holds world titles from all the major sanctioning bodies. And all that started back in 1920. So that's a year into Dempsey's reign, with first the New York State Athletic Commission, and then a year later, the National Boxing Association. Today, there are 4 such organizations, and the rules are such that it's very difficult to be undisputed, given the mandatory defenses demanded by all these different bodies. So in short, there have been 23 undisputed heavyweight champions from Jack Dempsey in the 20s to Lennox Lewis in the 90s. How should they be ranked? We'll get into it with Mike Ezra right after this.
You can follow us on Twitter @Gotham Variety, like us on Facebook, subscribe to our show on Apple Podcasts or Stitcher. We're on Spotify as well. Check out our website at gothamvariety.com, where you can send us your comments and questions. And if you love what we're doing, we'd love a 5-star review on the podcast platform of your choice. Reviews and ratings help keep our show on the charts, so more and more people can find us.
We are joined this week on Gotham Variety by a very special guest, Mike Ezra, author of Muhammad Ali, The Making of an Icon. Mike also contributed a really good chapter to a boxing compilation published 3 years ago called The Bittersweet Science. His chapter is titled Post-Primes and Career Arcs, Navigating Boxing's All-Time Rankings. And at my request, Mike kindly assembled his complete ranking of all 23 undisputed heavyweight champions. Mike, it's great to have you on the show. How you doing?
Oh, thanks so much for having me, Joe. I appreciate it, and I'm ready to talk heavyweight boxing.
So, rankings of this kind are hardly an exact science. But tell the listeners, if you would, the general standards and methodology that you applied to these 23 champions.
Well, what I wanted to do was think about them in basically 2 forms. First, kind of their resume, what they accomplished in their career, mostly at heavyweight, although in some cases I would apply things that a fighter did outside the heavyweight division at light heavyweight or cruiser to their ranking as a heavyweight champion if I thought that the skills that they used and the style that they used and the opponent they faced, I could conceive of it as a heavyweight fight, sort of, in a lower division, though. And so their resume, career accomplishments, who they beat, how they beat them, and then kind of that mysterious thing called peak, their best effort. What would it look like? And, you know, some fighters, their peak only lasts 1 or 2 fights. And if you did have a mythical matchup with that fighter, you can expect that fighter to not be in shape for that fight, Riddick, Bowe. So it's hard to really consider a Riddick, Bowe ever at their peak, for example, because he so rarely was. But those 2 things, total career arc, how well you've done on the scorecard, if you will, in the record book, and then just boiling down your skills to 1 fight, 1 night.
And as irresistible as it is to speculate about fantasy matchups of fighters from different eras, and we'll certainly do that today, when you consider all the factors that have changed between 1919, when Dempsey won the title, and the 1990s when Lennox Lewis fought, you know, from nutrition to frequency of fights to the kind of gloves they wore, to the very definition of what a heavyweight is. So there's no shortage of difficulties when comparing fighters from the olden days with more recent champions, right?
Absolutely. It's impossible. And I think that's why so many people invest in this particular argument. People are really invested in that argument. It's like your calling card sort of in boxing. And I think it's so attractive is because you can't be wrong. There are a lot of challenges in comparing fighters of different eras or even fighters of the same era that haven't fought each other. But it's something that people love to do so much that it has perpetuated itself as maybe the most important discussion in boxing among fans.
So you can find Mike's complete rankings in the show notes for this episode. I've also been posting them on Twitter, but we're going to sacrifice total thoroughness today in favor of a closer look at roughly the top half of his list. So Mike's ranking 1 through 10 in order is Muhammad Ali at the top, Joe Louis, Sonny Liston, Lennox Lewis, Evander Holyfield, Joe Frazier, Gene Tunney, George Foreman, Mike Tyson, and Jack Dempsey. But before we get to them, let's look at some guys who just missed that top 10. So at 11, you've got Rocky Marciano, 12, Riddick Bowe, 13, Floyd Patterson. And Floyd did not start his career as a heavyweight. He won the Olympic gold in 1952 as a middleweight. He fought light heavy for a while as a pro. Actually, when Marciano retired in 1956, Patterson was ranked as the top contender for Archie Moore's light heavyweight crown, and he was ranked just 5th as heavyweight contender. But a tournament of 6 was held to fill that vacant heavyweight throne, and Floyd had a really impressive 5th-round knockout of Archie Moore to become the new heavyweight champion. And Patterson, who had dazzling hand speed, maybe the fastest to that point for a heavyweight, he had kind of a strange career with some huge highs, including the knockouts of Ingemar Johansson in their second and third fights, but just some terrible losses too. The first fight of that trilogy with Johansson, but even worse were the 2 fights with Liston, both first-round knockouts. But then some pretty respectable later wins against some tough customers, Cavallo, Bonavina. So Mike, give me your general assessment, because you do have him up over some pretty strong champions, including Max Schmeling and Ezzard Charles.
Yeah, well, I think skills-wise, like you mentioned, Patterson is really up there in terms of almost the fastest feet of any champion in the division, and probably the fastest hands, maybe Tyson, maybe Ali. And I think where Patterson really fails to capture the boxing public's imagination is that he did not destroy the people that he was supposed to. And then he avoided the very best people in his division, who Sonny Liston ended up cleaning up, like the Cleveland Williams, the Zora Foleys, Eddie Machen. So where does the respect for Patterson come from? It comes from him being, like you said, a smaller man moving up in the division. And if you take out the losses to Liston, it all looks pretty good, minus Johansson. But Johansson was in peak form at the time and had a huge first-round knockout over Eddie Machen, who went 12 rounds with Sonny Liston. I mean, that was Johansson at his absolute best. Not a great champion by any means. But that's the only really terrible loss on Patterson's resume. And he was a contender in the division, oh my goodness, I think from like 1958 to 1972 or something like that. He was in the top 10 Ring magazine every single month for like 13, 14 years.
So let's talk about 2 guys in your top 10 that I was really pleased to see you rank so highly. Sonny Liston at number 3 and Gene Tunney at number 8. Very different backgrounds. Tunney, the intellectual, friends with F. Scott Fitzgerald. He lectured on Shakespeare at Yale. And Liston from just terrible, grinding poverty. I think one of 25 children, prison time, and then later an enforcer for the mob. But they had at least one thing in common. They were both unpopular champions for very different reasons. Liston, because of that prison record and the underworld associations, and he also detested reporters, which didn't help. And Tunney, because, well, first of all, he deposed a very popular champion in Jack Dempsey, but also his style, cold, analytical, excelled in defense, Now, I can sort of understand why they may have been unpopular champions during their reigns, but why is it, Mike, that these two guys, Liston with an overall record of 50-4, and Tunney a mind-boggling 82-1 with 4 draws, never lost as a heavyweight? Why don't they seem to get the reverence from the so-called experts that they deserve?
The Liston thing has to be the losses to Ali, and those are his most famous fights, and those are the fights, that the majority of people have seen of Sonny Liston. Any other Liston fights, now with YouTube, it's certainly easier. But to get his whole catalog, would take a little bit of work. But if you do that, and you do see the contender fights of Liston, I do not think it's any sort of exaggeration to say that that peak Liston from 1957, 58, 59, 60 was basically the heavyweight champion of the world, doing the title defenses that Patterson was not going to do for whatever reason. And those wins are sensational. He is destroying the guys he's in the ring with, breaking their cheekbones, knocking the teeth out with the mouthpiece, driving people out of the ring, first round KOs, guys staying down for several minutes, blood and cuts. And like the pay-per-view fight with Albert Westfall, or the closed circuit fight. Westfall goes down hard, like he had never been down before, and he just goes down like he was shot. These kinds of devastating knockouts that people did not get up from for a long time. Those quality of victories, and done in a skilled manner, too. Tremendously fast, not fast, but heavy jab that was quicker than you would think. Deceptively fast is what I want to say. Strong power in either hand. A great, great chin. He stood in there with Cleveland Williams, who is one of the heavyweight division's all-time bombers and who was in peak form at the time, knocking out everybody, and was expected by many to win that first fight with Sonny Liston. And Liston just stays in the pocket and drives Williams into submission. It's such an impressive, physical, strong victory against another excellent heavyweight at the time. So Liston wasn't afraid to take any risks as a contender. He cleaned out the division impressively. No one really went the distance with him. And the Patterson victories don't get any sort of respect because Patterson went down so easily. And the story is that, Patterson was afraid and really was like Michael Spinks against Tyson. But Patterson was an excellent fighter who nobody did like that. Give credit where credit's due to Liston on those wins. Sure, he was the bigger man, but Patterson fought them all and was never really crushed like that in the first round twice. And then Sonny Liston had a really good run after the Ali fights. And if you subtract the Ali fights, Liston's second to last fight, and then a early fight against Marty Marshall, in which he was laughing at Marshall supposedly and got his jaw broke while I was laughing, he avenged that loss to Marshall anyway. So he has an incredible run. The Ali fights may very well have been fixed, but even if they weren't, what's the big deal in losing to Ali? Who didn't lose to Ali that Ali fought besides Larry Holmes and Trevor Berbick at the end? So Liston's accomplishments and the way he did it, and also for his peak skill. And man, it's the skill part of it that actually makes me think that he could even have potentially beaten the peak Ali if things broke his way. And we're talking about the 1958-59 Liston, and definitely Joe Louis too. He could have blown Joe Louis out of the ring potentially. So Liston, I feel strongly about that one. I know less about Gene Tunney. His resume is incredible. To me, he is one of the top 10 pound for pound fighters of all time. His light heavyweight might be the toughest division of all. And not only did Tunney clean out the light heavyweight division, but when he does get to heavyweight, he beats a faded and kind of sitting on the shelf too long Jack Dempsey. And look, even if you can't stand Jack Dempsey and you want to underrate him, you'd put him in the top 25 of all-time heavyweights. I've never seen him lower than that. So here you have Gene Tunney boxing the ears off the undisputed champion, a top 25 at worst all-time heavyweight. And Tunney only loses 5 seconds of that fight to Dempsey. It's with the knockdown, the long count, which, come on. Tunney could have got up at the count of 2. Tunney, I think probably it's a lack of familiarity with his record. It's from a long time ago. The only heavyweight I can really think of from that far back that gets the kind of top recognition, well, Dempsey once did, but Jack Johnson's probably held in more regard. And there's a little more footage of Jack Johnson, and I think Jack Johnson gets praise for his social importance. So I think with Tunney, people think of him as a part-time heavyweight. He's from an era people don't have much film of. There are some fighters whose personality, you hinted at this a little bit here, It's like their personality gets drawn into the analysis of them as a fighter in a way that can often have kind of a deleterious effect on their legacy. And even during contemporary press coverage. So you took a guy like Ali, before he was known as gritty, when Ali was in his contender years, and he would dance, and he would say, I'm pretty, and he had kind of a high voice, and he wasn't married. There were people who put his non-traditional masculine personality and tried to think that he would be that way when the going got tough. That Ali wouldn't, quote unquote, man up. I mean, all these concepts are stupid. They're just constructions of masculinity that aren't true. But the boxing fans' fantasy is this guy's not a man. He calls himself pretty. He's not married. He dances around the ring. As soon as he gets hit, he's going to, react like a wimp, basically, because he has a wimpy style. And I think Sonny Liston, too, doesn't get credit for the footwork that he had. The way he cut off the ring and moved, and not quick, but efficient and fast. Sonny Liston did not need to wait for someone to get tired to knock them out. He could get guys running away from him at top speed and just cut off the ring and get there.
Now, two sluggers, Tyson and Marciano, you have very close. Tyson at 9, Marciano at 11. Now, I personally think that Marciano had the more impressive career. Obviously, the better record at 49-0 to Tyson's 50-6. Tyson also had 2 no contests, including that really weird fight where Andrew Galata refused to continue and was pelted with debris. But if you want to talk about toughness, Marciano had 0 quit in him, absolute pit bull. And let's face it, Tyson did. He could get frustrated. He could, I don't want to say panic, but lose his bearings, let's say. But before we get to Tyson, your general assessment of Marciano, Mike, and why you placed this undefeated fighter outside the top 10, albeit just outside.
Yeah, it's a good question with Rocky Marciano because the undefeated record certainly played a role. And it seems to me that as society gets more multicultural and as kind of worship of dead white men, for lack of a better word, becomes less and less of kind of the cultural norm, although it still is the cultural norm, Marciano necessarily becomes a casualty and all that, whether deserved or not. People who grew up, later than the 1950s will always take a second look at the era's icons, especially if they're a white person in a sport, in a division, you could say, that is dominated by, for a long time, African Americans. So there is definitely going to be that skeptical fan who grew up after the Civil Rights Movement, who takes a look at Marciano and says, people must have been overrating him. The reason I would rank him a little bit lower than the top 10, even though his positive attributes, his determination, not necessarily his chin, but his recuperative abilities, because he was dropped by Archie Moore, a light heavyweight. Marciano hurt in a lot of fights, cut in fights, never really fought and beat a great fighter, so you wouldn't know whether he'd be able to do it against the guys ranked higher than him. So there's a lot of what if with Marciano, if Liston hit him, what kind of damage would be done? So if Marciano was taking that kind of abuse against, second level fighters, how would he be able to walk through the men ranked above him?
So with Tyson, it seems like great fighters like Holyfield and Lennox Lewis handled him really well, and some second-tier fighters, Tony Tucker, or even a third-tier fighter like Quick Tillis, who was 10 years older than Mike when they fought in Tyson's prime, and Tillis gave him problems. But compare these reactions to adversity. Tyson gets headbutted in the Holyfield rematch. I think it was accidental, but he gets cut, he knows he's losing, and so he decides to take a bite out of Holyfield's ear, whereas Marciano gets his nose split open by Ezzard Charles in their rematch, a much worse injury than Tyson's. You can see it on YouTube. His face was just a bloody mess. The fight was in danger of being stopped any second, so his crown was in jeopardy, and, he knocks Charles out cold, which wasn't easy to do under any circumstances, much less with a split nose. And something I noticed with Tyson in later years, I don't know if you agree, but he seemed to abandon that bob and weave defense that served him so well in those early years. But your thoughts, Mike, on Tyson's career as a whole?
Well, there's so many points rambling in my head from what you just came up with there. So I might have to go back to your original question and ask you for it. But, Tyson has in his career the same phenomenon that Ali had in some ways, with the difference being their chin and their determination. Earlier in his career, Tyson's really faster than all his opponents, doesn't get hit much, has great defense, and the bob and weave that you mentioned. That's early Ali, too. But Tyson's known as a slugger because what he brought back after, people missed the punches was devastating knockout power, as, Ali just kind of stung like a bee. But later in Ali's career, he gets hit all the time, and he shows that he has a great chin. That's true with Tyson, too. I mean, he took tremendous beatings against Holyfield and Douglas. But then there's a certain point in Tyson's career where he just says, I refuse to do that. I refuse to take a Marciano-esque beating if I'm going to lose. I mean, because even Ali was willing to take those beatings when he lost. But Tyson goes from defensive fighter to someone who was going to rely on his ability to take punches, too. But he was not mentally prepared to make that transition the way Ali was. And I do think that Marciano-Tyson is definitely not a foregone conclusion. I mean, I rank Frazier over Foreman, and we know how their head-to-head matchup went. So I don't think ranking above someone is necessarily saying that they would win in a head-to-head, because if you do play it out, so what happens? So Tyson comes out and rushes Marciano, hits him with a barrage. Maybe Marciano takes a knee, maybe not. Maybe Marciano comes back and hits Tyson low. Maybe Marciano clinches. There's a lot of possibilities there. Marciano had a really rough kind of inside game. So what would happen after the first moments is really hard to even understand.
All right, so let's get into Holyfield and Bowe, who you have at 5 and 12, respectively. Bowe won their amazing trilogy 2 out of 3, and the second fight, which Bowe lost a majority decision, was extremely close. But that second fight was totally bizarre, with that paraglider crashing into the ropes, causing a long delay. Probably should have been called a no contest. But the unofficial AP scorecard had Bowe winning that fight. Now, I should say on Holyfield's behalf that he was giving up a huge amount of weight in those fights and performed heroically, as he did in the Lennox Lewis fights. Actually, the fight that Lewis won, I thought was closer than the one that was called a draw, which Lennox pretty much dominated. But your thoughts, Mike, on placing Holyfield 7 spots over Bowe? And by the way, you're not alone in this. Most rankings I've seen have Holyfield over Bowe, despite Bowe having won that trilogy and having the better record at 43-1 to Holyfield's 44-10 with 2 draws.
Oh, man, Holyfield at the end, racking up all those losses and making his record look bad, but getting out of bankruptcy problems, I guess. So Bowe accomplished much less in his career than he should have, and he also did not face Lennox Lewis, who beat him in the amateurs, and the whole dropping of the WC belt into the trash can just reeks of avoiding the opposition. So Bowe doesn't fight everyone that he's supposed to. His peak is very short. Title defenses against Dopes and Ferguson, who were brought there to lose in the first round. And by the way, Bowe doesn't even look that impressive in those fights. He just goes in there and slugs against already defeated men. Nothing great, nothing devastating. The guys get right up after the knockout. Dopes doesn't even think it should be stopped. So then he fights Holyfield, right, who he's much bigger than. And Holyfield still manages to give him hell. And after that, Bowe's career is over, pretty much. And by the way, he's being outfought by a dead tired Holyfield who had something wrong with his body for like a 2 or 3 year period. No one knows if it was heart disease or steroids used wrong or whatever. But there was something wrong with Evander Holyfield in that third fight. And Holyfield still beat up Bowe until he ran out of steam completely. Holyfield did. Holyfield has a much more impressive pre-championship career than Riddick Bowe. And here I do give Holyfield props for what he did at cruiserweight because it validates what he did at heavyweight. His gut checks at cruiserweight are precursors to his gut checks at heavyweight. And so I kind of count that on his resume. But even without the cruiserweight stuff, Holyfield didn't avoid any challenges. He did fight Lennox Lewis, who was so much bigger than him, at an advanced age past his prime. I mean, Holyfield got hurt a lot in his fights, but really never broke in them. And even with the Bowe fight, the first fight, where he takes a pounding, Holyfield keeps coming back, doesn't get knocked out. So it's the way you lose, too. Because if you're talking about these fantasy matchups against other great fighters, you're going to be in trouble at some point. Like people who put together these matchups, like whatever, Liston, Holmes, and they think one guy's just going to get killed. I mean, when did that ever happen to a Sonny Liston or a Rocky Marciano? No one really goes in and just demolishes these guys, no matter how good the fighter is. Take Bowe, though, for example. I mean, right after the win over Holyfield, the third fight, his next fights are against Galata, and he really gets beaten badly in those fights. So there's kind of no post-prime for Riddick Bowe. We don't see what he could do when he wasn't at his peak skills. So we really don't get a sense of his determination. We see that he didn't have dedication. He didn't come into the ring in shape always. So when you think about the fantasy matchups, what is he really going to do when a great fighter is put in front of him, who's his size, who's in shape? And if Bowe's not at his best and has to pull something from the well, I wouldn't see it happening.
Well, that actually leads to my next question about two of your top 10 guys that did face off in the ring, Frazier and Foreman, who you have at 6 and 8 respectively. Again, very close. But Foreman did have the higher win percentage, and despite fighting 40 or so more times than Frazier, he had only one more loss. Of course, the two head-to-heads, Foreman dominated. Then Foreman regained his title in the 90s. Frazier never did. I'm not saying I disagree with your placements necessarily, and Foreman certainly had his weaknesses. He was vulnerable to speed and fast counterpunching, and he would often fatigue in later rounds. But your thought process, Mike, slotting Frazier 2 rungs above Foreman.
Yeah, that's a tricky one. And I think most people, it would be valid to put Foreman above Frazier for sure. Foreman's most impressive victory, without a doubt, is against Frazier. And Foreman has some pretty bad losses, and I would also say some bad wins. Foreman-Lyle might be ranked up there as one of the all-time most exciting fights, but that is a bad win for George Foreman, in my opinion. He took way too much punishment and really took a long time to put away Ron Lyle and put himself at such unnecessary risk. That fight showed a really low boxing IQ, and I think that actually plagued George Foreman through the first part of his career. And then just certain stylistic problems you mentioned. Anyone with a jab, footwork, movement. I mean, they talk about him cutting off the ring against Ali, but that was an Ali who couldn't dance anymore. The original Ali would have made a fool of George Foreman in a way that the 1971 Ali could not make a fool and never could make a fool of Joe Frazier. Foreman, in the second part of his career, he's got the one win against Mora, who's not a good champion, and that's really it. And the win over Frazier is stylistically served up to him just so perfectly. I mean, Frazier's a slow starter, so you could get to Joe Frazier early. And Joe Frazier fought really stupid in that fight. He came right after Foreman. He didn't take Foreman seriously. He undertrained badly for that fight. His weight, did he weigh like 220 pounds? Or
Yeah, close. I think it was around 215 in the first fight with Foreman, and then a bit heavier in the rematch in 76.
I mean, he's like 10 or 11 pounds more than I think the first Ali fight. So Joe Frazier got soft as a champion. His weaknesses played into Foreman's strengths perfectly. Foreman's win over Norton is pretty great. And after that, I don't have anything really to say about his... It's like, again, I think like fighters get reduced to... He gets reduced to the wins over Frazier and Mora and the losses to Ali. And since Ali is so great, he gets excused for those, I think, and has become somewhat overrated.
All right, let's talk about another guy in your top 10 who I was really happy to see placed so high at number 4, Lennox Lewis, 41, 2, and 1. Really should have been 42 and 2. That draw with Holyfield was wrong. But barring a couple of rare outliers, you never really saw Lewis get beat up, And with the exception of Bowe, who Lewis never fought, as you said, Bowe vacated the WBC title in 93 rather than face him. The guys Lennox beat are practically a who's who of the era. Tyson, Holyfield, Klitschko. I mean, that stoppage because of a cut over Klitschko's eye, that was controversial. I thought it was the right call. But Lewis, he always seemed to get better as the fights wore on, and he avenged his 2 losses to Hasim Rahman and Oliver McCall decisively. That McCall rematch had to be one of the most disturbing fights I've ever seen. McCall basically had a nervous breakdown, wandering around the ring and then finally bursting into tears. But again, Lennox Lewis sometimes seems to get lost in the shuffle when people talk about the upper echelon of the elite, But talk about Lennox Lewis, Mike, and what went into your decision to place him 4th over some bona fide legends.
Sure. I mean, you need artistry, I think, to some degree when you're making your heavyweight rankings. You need to use your imagination because, I'm extreme in this case. I really don't think any of the heavyweight fighters really, I guess I have to say except for Ali, but really not even Ali, deserves to be in the top 50 pound for pound of all time. And once you are able to accept that your very, very greatest heavyweight champions, except for Ali and Liston, I would say, have very noticeable flaws in their game, you can begin to get with the idea that someone who is knocked cold by two not-so-great fighters is still awesome. He avenged those victories decisively in the Rockman fight. I mean, he was dominating and clowning. That's why the only reason he got caught. And when he got serious in the second fight, right, he killed those guys. Yep. And nobody talks about Schmeling Lewis 1. I mean, that fight's not even really considered anymore, even though it's an important indicator of Joe Lewis's weaknesses. But there's no doubt that the true result is the second one between Lewis and Schmeling, just like Lennox Lewis's true results in the fights he lost are in the rematches. And Oliver McCall, in my opinion, a top 50 all-time heavyweight probably. So, I mean, he's a good fighter. I mean, then you got Vitaly Klitschko, whose resume isn't that great. But in terms of talent, he might be a top 10 all-time heavyweight or very close to it. I mean, those are humongous wins. Holyfield's aging and Tyson's aging. So there's no way Lennox Lewis can get credit for those victories that he deserves.
I agree. And you mentioned Klitschko as potentially an all-time great. And we've been focusing all of our attention on the undisputed heavyweight champs of the 20th century, which leaves out a couple of great champions who were not undisputed. That would be first and foremost Larry Holmes and Ken Norton. For those who haven't seen it, check out Holmes versus Norton on YouTube. They only fought that one time in 1978, and Norton, he was sort of at the end of his prime, but he was still a force. And it's one of the most brutal 15-rounders you will ever see. Extremely close, split decision with a final round that ranks with the greats. But Mike, where do these two guys, Larry Holmes and Ken Norton, fit in with the undisputed champs we've been talking about, and why?
Norton probably makes my 25 best heavyweights or so, 30 best heavyweights or so. His wins are sort of disgrace his record, but he could have won two of the three Ali fights.
I thought he won the third one.
Yeah, he did win the third one, I would say. So, I mean, if those wins go his way, history looks at him much differently. And same with the Larry Holmes loss. If he had won that fight, I mean, at that late stage in his career, beating someone who would come on to be, you know, one of the best heavyweights of all time, that would be a remarkable post-prime victory for Norton. Yeah. And he was a whisker away from losing that fight, and you could score that fight for him.
Yeah, I think Norton's big mistake was laying back in the first 5 rounds and trying to get Holmes to overextend and tire, which never really happened. So even though Norton won a number of later rounds, he was just too far behind.
Yeah, he wouldn't be the first fighter to do that. So Norton's losses, I think, are overstated, and he has losses on his career that I would call good losses, losses that really should have been wins. So he ranks high. He's up there with a Floyd Patterson. He might beat Floyd Patterson. He might beat Riddick Bowe on a really great day. And as far as Holmes, well, Holmes is just incredible. And again, in the heavyweight division, you have to get used to the idea that your all-time greats could get clipped by a contender. So yes, it makes perfect sense that one of the greatest heavyweights of all time, Larry Holmes, could be in deep trouble against Ronaldo Snipes, could be in deep trouble against a Tim Witherspoon who had about, 15 pro fights and no amateur career. That's okay. That happens in the heavyweight division. They hit hard. They're huge. Humans aren't supposed to take punches from people that big. But who recovers is the question. And that's Larry Holmes. If it was all about chin, George Chuvalo would be the greatest heavyweight of all time.
That's right.
So Holmes always recovered. I mean, the only time he didn't recover was in the comeback fight against Tyson. And I really do think that fight should be almost wiped from the record.
Now let's talk about something that's been debated for literally decades. Who was greater, Muhammad Ali or Joe Louis? I guess I'd give Ali the edge, as you did, but since they're so close, let me play devil's advocate and make a case for Louis having the slightly better career. Louis had the better record, 66-3 to Ali's 56-5, so 95.6 win percentage versus 91.8 for Ali. Joe's title reign lasted over 11 years. Ali's 3 reigns combined amounted to just over 7, and Ali had some pretty lackluster showings between 76 and 81. The Jimmy Young fight, for example, another controversial decision in the third Norton fight. He also lost to Spinks and Burbick, while Lewis, his only 3 losses were to Hall of Famers, Schmeling, Ezzard Charles, Marciano. Yes, Ali faced stiffer competition, you can never dispute that, but he also lost to some of that competition, and Lewis in his career beat 8 Hall of Famers to Ali's 7. So those are some of the points on the Lewis side of the ledger. But your thoughts, Mike, as you balance the careers of these 2 giants, was it quality of competition that made the difference, or was it so close that you had to look at what they might have done head-to-head?
I think at the end of the day, probably size. Just that Ali is bigger. It's hard to envision Lewis beating him, and it's easy to envision Ali beating Lewis. I think that, for me, is the biggest difference of all. I do want to speak to the pro-Lewis argument, though, because one of the things about these peak matchups, these fantasy matchups, that I don't think people give enough credit to is, what if you were to go a little bit off-peak, as all the greats had their off nights? And that's part of their historical legacy, what happens on their off nights. So say the peak Ali is 1960s, well, really 68 or 69 when he wasn't fighting. That's one Ali. But now, so say Lewis couldn't beat the 1969 Ali in someone's mind. Okay, then, when could Lewis beat Ali? 1970? 73? When do you get to that spot in Ali's fadedness where now you think Lewis could seize the advantage? And I don't think people do enough of that when they're trying to create these matchups between fighters, because not everyone did come in at their best. And that is the greatness of Joe Louis. He was able to win for so many years, including, the military stint, and fight some really good fighters, too. I mean, you didn't even mention like Billy Conn and guys like that. Yep. And, you can't call that a bad win for Joe Louis. I mean, Billy Conn's a Hall of Famer and a top 10 all-time light heavyweight, and not that much smaller than Joe Louis. And Louis finds a way to win. And then the rematch is the true result, in which he bashes Billy Conn.
You think it's fair to say that of these, top 12 or 13 heavyweights we've discussed, that no one faced the level of competition that Ali did with the frequency he did over the course of his career? I mean, Liston twice, Frazier and Norton 3 times each, Foreman, Holmes. Would you agree with that?
Yes, of course. He was blessed by that era, and he emerged as the king of the hill. And he was lucky in the sense that the worst possible matchup for him, Liston, Liston may or may not have been compromised in those matches.
Well, I think he was in the second fight. I mean, no one will ever convince me that Ali knocked him out with that little pity-pat right hand. I mean, Liston had one of the iron chins of all time. I mean, you could hit him with a sledgehammer, he wasn't going down.
Right. He was only knocked down once before that in the Marty Marshall fight. It was a flash knockdown. The newspapers say he got up at the count of 0. And it was almost impossible to hurt Liston until that last fight with Leotis Martin, where he gets knocked out cold. And Cleveland Williams makes him take a backward step, but that's Cleveland Williams. So, it does seem fishy. But Ali had enough other victories, of course, to compensate for that loss. And
yes,
you can't blame him. I mean, the fact that Liston didn't kill him, is really good enough, because that's the media narrative at the time, that Ali's going to get killed. So the first fight probably, I don't think, was fake, but even if it was, the idea that Ali wasn't killed was a victory in itself. It's kind of like Hagler-Leonard. I mean, just Leonard going 12 rounds is really the victory right there.
So let's talk about Dempsey, who, for all his exceptional power and aggressiveness, has been somewhat overrated historically, in my opinion. Great, no question, but still overrated. And not just back in the day when people like Nat Fleischer would routinely place him over Joe Louis. I saw a recent heavyweight ranking, I think it was in Ring Magazine, with Dempsey ranked over Foreman, Frazier, Tyson, Liston, Lennox Lewis, Holyfield, and Tunney, which is just insane. I mean, he would have fared very poorly against the first 6, I think. And Tunney was his exact contemporary, same weight, and beat him solidly twice, which with a much better record overall. And Dempsey, he didn't really defend his title that many times. And he took a 2-year break after knocking out Georges Carpentier in 1921, took a 3-year break after he won that Firpo fight at the Polo Grounds where he was knocked out of the ring. That was the last successful defense of his title. He was dominated by Tunney after he came back. He was dominated for the most part by Jack Sharkey, and Sharkey really controlled most of their fight before forgetting the cardinal rule to protect yourself at all times. Dempsey floored him while Sharkey had his head turned to complain about low blows. But Mike, give me your take on Dempsey, which I realize presents unusual challenges in that the vast majority of his fights are not on film.
Sure, and Sharkey's the original Victor Ortiz, I guess, turning his head like that. Dempsey is not an easy one to rate. And I do think you're right. He's overrated, probably because he was such a huge cultural figure in the way of Babe Ruth or Red Grange. I mean, they were just these huge figures of the era who brought in so much money and interest in the sport. And you're right. I mean, when he was faced with another all-time great in Gene Tunney, he lost. Although Carpentier might be an all-time great at light heavyweight. His resume is thin, but the win over Jess Willard, who was known for his toughness and to crush him in such vicious fashion and cause such injuries to him, like the Liston fights, I think that does tell you something about his ability to hit. I mean, so much so that there's the rumor that he had the papier-mâché gloves made by Doc Kearns. But there's no evidence of that.
No, and it was pretty much debunked later. I mean, Frazier was there in Toledo that day watching when Dempsey's hands were wrapped, and he didn't see anything. So I think it was just a made-up story.
And so for him to get a guy who is known for toughness, combined with the reputational largesse of his peers, even the Nat Fleischers of the world who have weird relationships to black fighters. That's really where I'm ranking Jack Dempsey as someone who was a really good combination puncher at a time where you did see more single shots from the heavyweights. So someone who fought with speed and power, and at his best certainly was a killing machine.
Okay, so now it's time for a lightning round of fantasy matchups. Heavyweights from different eras in their primes. I'll give my takes as well. And for the listeners, Mike did not have these matchups in advance. I sort of threw these together just before we went on the air, but I did my best to come up with some fairly even matchups as far as weight and reach. And for those who may not know, reach is wingspan. It's outstretched fingertip to fingertip. So Mike, first of all, prime Sonny Liston versus prime Lennox Lewis. Same reach, 84 inches, Lewis with the height and weight advantage.
Very tough, very tough. Liston would be trying to get inside, and it would be a question if Lewis let him in. And I think that would be the weakness there, is that Lewis did let guys sit on his chest, and he did let people into the pocket who he could have better fought from the outside. Like the second Rockman fight is fought on the outside, and that's dominant. The first Rockman fight he's dominating too, but he lets him get too close. I think he let guys get too close, and I think Liston would win by knockout.
I happen to agree with you. I think it's a very intriguing matchup, but I would say, even with the weight differential, Liston, he still has the power advantage with both the jab, and people talk about Sonny's jab as the hardest in history. And in addition to his enormous strength, he had these freakishly huge hands like cannonballs. And he also had the chin to hang in there with Lennox. Again, just a brick wall. So I think that, that durability and that power would overcome Lewis's superior mobility. I see Liston cutting off the ring. I see Liston hammering away at the arms and body and finally catching Lewis with a late headshot for the knockout. Okay, our second matchup, two guys whose careers we just compared. Prime Joe Louis, so I'd say that's around 1937 when he beat Schmeling, and Prime Ali.
The matchup is so good for Ali in terms of not only size, but if you think about who gave Joe Louis problems, it's people who are fast. It's smaller guys who are fast, like Billy Conn. But even mobile heavyweights like a Joe Walcott could give him problems. So this really bodes poorly for Lewis in this matchup.
Lewis would have the edge on power, but looking back, Ali beat a number of guys with more power than Lewis. I mean, Liston, Foreman, Ernie Shavers, maybe even Ron Lyle, who Foreman called the hardest hitter he ever fought. But, if Lewis was outboxed in his prime by a lighter Billy Conn for 12 rounds in their first fight, before Conn stupidly tried to go toe-to-toe with him and got knocked out, and if Lewis was outboxed by Ezzard Charles, that was a little later, but you have to think that, prime Ali would have been able to outbox and evade him. I don't see Ali knocking him out, but I do see him getting a unanimous decision. Okay, another Ali matchup, this one with Lennox Lewis.
Oh, now that's, believe it or not, I've actually never thought of that. Now that could be a problem for Muhammad Ali, and it's tough to ever pick against Ali at his peak. But if the betting odds were any better than 2-1, it would make sense to bet on Lennox Lewis in that fight. Ali really, I can't think of anyone that big he ever fought. And Lewis had the really good jab, which could give Ali some problems. Ken Norton put a jab in his face. And here, Lewis would want to be on the inside. So this would be a different fight for him than the Liston fight, where he'd want to keep it on the outside. And, I don't know if Lennox Lewis is good enough at cutting off the ring or not to trap Ali in 1968. So I guess I'd give Ali a very boring tactical 15-round decision, but that's not one Ali would look good in at all, I don't think.
No, and I'm actually going to go ahead and pick Lewis in this one. I just think in his prime, which for Lewis came later than most heavyweights. I feel like he hit his prime when he was at like 30 or so, around the time of that Tommy Morrison fight. I think he was technically superior, a more complete boxer than anyone Ali ever fought, with the possible exception of Larry Holmes, and I'm not even sure about that. And with his reach, that jab would give Ali the same kind of headache that Ali's jab gave so many fighters. So I think this would be a close decision for Lennox Lewis. And one more thing, I don't think Lewis would be as vulnerable to Ali's mind games as Frazier and others were. He strikes me as a very secure individual.
Extreme in his mental toughness. I think maybe number one in the division.
Okay, prime Mike Tyson. So for me, that's, let's say, 86, 87. Against his idol, or one of them, prime Jack Dempsey.
Oh, wow. Well, I think I like Tyson in this one. I just think he's got more skill than Dempsey, actually. And I don't think Dempsey was no mastermind with the mind games or anything like that. I actually could see Dempsey just coming right into Tyson and losing badly.
I agree with you. I actually think this would be the least competitive of the ones we've mentioned. Similar styles, bob and weave, hyper aggressive. I think Tyson, though, had greater hand speed than Dempsey, so I would say KO in the third. Okay, this is a really interesting one. Peak George Foreman, so let's say 73, against peak Tyson. And even though George is quite a bit taller than Tyson, their prime weights would actually be comparable. I looked it up. Foreman's weight the night he took the crown from Frazier was 218, and Tyson, when he knocked out Larry Holmes, was 216. But your thoughts, Mike, prime Foreman, prime Tyson.
Yeah, I've thought about this one. I really like Foreman in this matchup, and I do tend to devalue Foreman's career. But I think Tyson comes right to Foreman, and Foreman has a really, really good chin. And I just think he'd be able to take more of what Tyson brings than what Tyson was able to take what Foreman brings.
Absolutely. I think they would both inflict serious pain, and I think Foreman would handle it better. And Tyson, it's ironic. He had that amazing quote, "Everyone has a plan until they get punched in the face," which is such a great quote, and it's so true. But I think that also applied to him. Sometimes I don't think he had a plan when he took a hard punch to the face. So I think in the end, prime Foreman would probably have done to Tyson what he did to Frazier. Although I should say, I'm not remotely as sure of the result had they fought in real life during Foreman's comeback in the 90s, which I've heard differing things about. Some people say Tyson wanted no part of Foreman. Some say the reverse. Have you ever been able to establish why that fight never happened?
Yeah, I don't know the truth behind that, but I do think that would have been a bad one for Tyson, actually. He had everything to lose in a fight like that. I think probably the boxing people saw in Tyson someone who was done a lot faster than the boxing fan noticed it. So I think in the 90s, actually, he would have been ripe for George Foreman anytime. Even as early as 1994, 1995, with a faded George Foreman. And I will say this, the matchup that really would have been the one that would have blown people's minds, if Tyson had been baited into a fight with Roy Jones around 1999, let's say, or something like that. Jones would have beat Tyson, and he would have been considered the greatest fighter of all time. And I'm glad that didn't happen because he wouldn't have deserved the accolades.
And you take Jones to task a bit in your chapter in The Bittersweet Science. Okay, last one. Probably the biggest heavyweight clash of the modern era that never happened. Lennox Lewis once again versus Riddick Bowe.
Well, I'll narrow it down to some pop psychology here. And I think we're going to have the same pick here. Lewis knocked out Bowe in the amateurs. And he wasn't supposed to do that. And I think Bowe never recovered from that. And I once saw Riddick Bowe say to Lennox Lewis, "I'm not afraid of you." I've never heard anyone say that, and I've never said that to anyone unless I was afraid of them. So Lewis by knockout.
Agreed. But this is another one I'd love to see just because their talents offset each other so well. I mean, Bowe, the stronger two-handed puncher. Lewis had that defensive skill set. Bowe had the superior chin, I think, but Lewis, the planner, the strategist, smarter, better conditioned. But I agree with you. I think we agreed on all of these with the exception of Ali, Lennox Lewis. Okay, final question, Mike. Let's step outside the heavyweight class for a second. Now, you ranked Ali as the number one heavyweight. I would have to agree. But pound for pound, is Ali the greatest of all time, as he told us ad nauseum? Would you go with Sugar Ray Robinson, as I would, or is there somebody else?
Pound for pound, I don't think really the heavyweights belong in that conversation at all. I mean, Ali, I'd struggle to put him in the top 50. I mean, what all-time greats back up with their hands down? What all-time greats can't move clockwise? What all-time greats get hit over and over again by Ernie Shavers? Ali's defense wasn't great once he lost his reflexes. So there's a lot of flaws in Ali's game. There wasn't a lot of flaws in light heavyweight Gene Tunney's game or Harry Grebb's game, even though there's no film of him. So I put Robinson there.
I've been watching a ton of old fights on YouTube because of the lockdown and there being no live sports. And Robinson, he really towers head and shoulders above the competition, just a total master. And to hear more of Mike's sharp analysis, I would encourage all of you to pick up The Bittersweet Science. As I said, his chapter in there is stellar, and he covers a number of non-heavyweights we did not cover today, including Floyd Mayweather, Roy Jones, Sugar Ray Leonard, Marvin Hagler, and one of my personal favorites, Roberto Duran. Some of his takes may surprise you, but he backs them up with logic, and he also wrote a book called Muhammad Ali, The Making of an Icon. Mike, thanks so much for taking the time to, make these rankings and being part of the show. I really appreciate it.
Joe, I had a lot of fun doing this. I would have talked for another hour. Thank you.
My pleasure. All right, we'll come back. More Gotham Variety in just a moment.
Your feedback is important to us. On Twitter, @Gotham Variety, on our Facebook page, or you can email the program, joe@gothamvariety.com. Really, however you'd like to engage with us, we love engaging with you. And if you'd like to join our family and get exclusive access to bonus content, please go to patreon.com/GothamVariety and subscribe.
And that'll do it for this week's episode of Gotham Variety. Don't forget to check us out and subscribe on Apple, Stitcher, or Spotify so you don't miss a single episode. Thanks so much for joining us. Take care, stay cool, and I'll see you soon.